Amazing. I'm personally very, very excited about this Dark Mode episode, hosting the World Economic Forum, Sean and Joanna. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you for having us.
Before we kick off, I do just want to actually bring everything up to a high level and just ask for Sean, perhaps if you could just give us really what the work of the Economic Forum is, what you guys do day to day. Could just bring that to the audience to start with.
Yeah, certainly. So we are the Organization for International Public-Private Partnership, which is quite the mouthful. But what that means is where we have problems, like let's say cybercrime, where no one can solve it in one country, and it clearly requires partnership between the private sector and the public sector. So for cybercrime, again, you need law enforcement working with some of the companies that control technical infrastructure. You need everyone having some idea of what the threat landscape is. And the resources for this are across the public sector and the private sector. So we get involved in trying to bring the experts together with the decision makers to get the right recommendations so they can actually start working together and doing stuff that's going to move the needle a little bit. What we tend to be best known for publicly is our annual meeting in Davos, where we have an awful lot of people fly in from around the world, from business, actually also from academia and civil society, and from public sector, from governments. And that can be a place where you'll see us make statements on cybersecurity, which is about raising awareness of the problem, primarily so that nobody can run away from it. So whether that's cybercrime, where we made large statements this year, or the fact that some smaller countries are being attacked by larger ones. We had the Albanian Prime Minister speaking about the impact of Iranian cyber attacks, or Iranian alleged by the Albanians, Iranian cyber attacks on their country's infrastructure, and getting groups to say, actually, we're going to do something about it and hold themselves to it publicly. So we had, in relation to cybercrime collaboration this year, we were very lucky to have a group of private sector, think PayPal, Santander, Microsoft, and Fortinet stand up and say they're going to collaborate really on understanding and mapping out how cybercrime groups and how they operate. And we're able to have Interpol say they're very interested in what's happening and might also act on the results of that. So that's kind of on the broad. We bring everyone together to say, yes, we have a problem. We all agree there's something. What can we do about it? And then standing up and saying we're going to do something about it. We try to hold them to it afterwards.
Nice one. Thanks, Sean. There's a lot in there as well. I mean, Davos 2023, the Global Cybersecurity Outlook Report, all of these key resources that I'm keen to deep dive into. But before we do that, Joanna, I did want to get your perspective just to help us bring the relevance to a really key part of the organization, which is the Cybersecurity Center. Could you tell us a little bit more about the World Economic Forum's Center for Cybersecurity?
Yes, for sure. Thank you. So, absolutely, the Center for Cybersecurity was founded back in 2018. And I guess it was upon the recognition that cybersecurity was a global issue and that needed to be tackled on its own. And yes, so really our vision is to support every individuals and organizations to securely benefit from technological progress, right? And how we also operate is that we think ourselves as an impartial platforms to bring those stakeholders together. As Sean was saying, we're right in the World Economic Forum, which has that impartial view, and we're very much on that as well. And yes, I would say that we also drive action across a range of topics that are under three main pillars. We look at enhancing cyber resilience on one part. We look at strengthening global cooperation on another one. And third, we are also looking at navigating cyber frontiers, right? What's in the foresight, what's in the outlook, and how can we prepare for it? I guess a couple of other things in the Center for Cybersecurity. We have our annual meeting on cybersecurity that takes place in Geneva. That's a bit like our mini Davos, focused on cybersecurity. And there we bring a few topics that we work on year round with our stakeholder and our partners. Again, it's about public-private partnership, but also we bring new topics that need to start to be tackled. And last but not least, we have our Chief Information Security Officer community, which is the community that gathers all our senior-most cybersecurity executives, and we bring them together to tackle like global issues. Again, it's cross-sector and cross-regional. So that's about the center.
That's amazing. Thanks, Joanna and Sean. And just if you wouldn't mind giving the audience a bit of background as to what each of you do within the World Economic Forum and how you have become to get to your position in the World Economic Forum. And I'm keen to dive right in after that.
Yeah, so I took a very winding route into cybersecurity. I want to make a point to that because we need so many more people into it. People need to know that it's open to them. So I started out very briefly in journalism in the defense sector, but quickly moved into private investigations, really focusing on asset tracing. This is quite a while ago, so it was before we had mainly digital funds, which meant I got to chase, let's say, primarily oligarch money through the European financial system, try and track that down and grab their assets, whether that's property or yachts. Moved into anti-money laundering investigations in one of the major banks and financial crime intelligence. And just over time, the direction that the criminals were moving brings people towards cybersecurity and cybercrime. So that was my entry point via non-technical investigations. Joined the Center for Cybersecurity at the Forum about 5 years ago, where I first started focusing on the kind of more painful regulatory and policy issues around cybersecurity. So how do we get an entire sector to move together to agree on dull but important things, such as how do we all agree on what is evidence for good cybersecurity practice so we can all work together and secure our supply chain. But over time, went back to working on disruption of cybercrime. And more recently, I've had the joy, frankly, of running some of our major research projects, and such as our Global Cybersecurity Outlook report. And that's where we take publicly available trends on the threat landscape, which we're all generally aware of, but then compare that to the lived experience of our cybersecurity experts, our cybersecurity community, and other executives such as chief risk officers, chief information officers, to try and make sense of what's happening in a more practical way, try and identify where there are these gaps in communication between different parts of organizations, and make some practical recommendations as to what we can all start doing about that.
Fantastic. That is certainly a winding road to get to the cybersecurity space, Sean, but I think it's a great message you send there, and it's something that Gabe and I are very passionate about. Is regardless of where you are in life right now, your skill set can be directly translatable into a cybersecurity role at some point, and that's the beauty of the industry that we work in. Joanna, if you wouldn't mind giving us your background.
Yes, for sure. So same as Sean, I wasn't predestined to end up in cybersecurity. I came to the forum from consulting services, the cybersecurity team, where I was actually working and helping CISOs identify and prioritize the risks that mattered most to them, and also implement the controls to mitigate that risk in different areas. And with a specialization, I guess, in cyber risk management and governance, as this was, what I initially studied, I wasn't necessarily expecting my first job to be in IT security. So that's just ended up happening. And since then, I worked in the field. And at the forum, I have a few hats, actually, I guess. I lead the Chief Information Security Officer community, which is, as I said before, cross-regional and cross-sectoral community of our senior-most cybersecurity executives. On top of that, I'm also very much involved in the frontiers topic, the foresight topic, the pillar I was mentioning before, as I lead the partnership we have with UC Berkeley and especially their Center for Long-Term Cybersecurity on the Cybersecurity Futures 2030 initiative. And another point is that I lead partner engagement with our current and prospective partners and discussing with them, understanding what are their top of mind issues to make sure that when they do get engaged with us, they get engaged where it makes the most impact. So that's a bit about my background.
Amazing. I see Gabe come off there because I know she wants to jump straight into Davos, but I just wanted to make one quick point about Davos before we jump in there. You mentioned Edi Rama, the Prime Minister of Albania, and he joined a panel during that session in Davos about securing critical infrastructure with the Dragos CEO, Robert M. Lee. And I found it really interesting, some of the discussion points that were raised in that panel discussion. And I thought that Edi Rama made a great point, which sort of brings home why we're all talking about cybersecurity and the work that we do and how important it is globally. And this is quoting Edie here. He says, if cybercrime was a state, it would be the third largest economy after US and China. based on some assessments, in 2015, cyber operations was around $3 trillion, and it is forecasted to be more than 10 trillion in 2025. He also looked pretty baller in his get up in that panel as well. I thought it was really cool.
We got a good laugh from Sean then, Ben. So I think you're on the money.
Yeah. Look, I think Prime Minister Rama makes an impression wherever he goes, and he's an exceptionally good storyteller, someone who can really bring home why cybersecurity matters, and that's why these conferences like Davos have extreme value, because people who have this direct experience can speak to the public, but can also speak on a private level to business executives, governments, who people who haven't experienced this. And the issue with cybersecurity and preparing for the risk is very often that until something goes horribly wrong and you have that direct experience, it's difficult to for decision makers to really put the resources, investment, and time into them. There's been some very good studies done, not by us, by a mixture of, I think, Oxford and Istari, focusing on executives in ASEAN and the Oceania region. And they found exactly that when a CEO is most likely to actually have prepared their company, it's when in their past they've been burned basically by a cyber attack. And also where CEOs are what they're most likely to do when something goes wrong, unfortunately, isn't talk to their CISO. It's to pick up the phone to another CEO they know and say, what did you do under these circumstances? What happened? And I think that's one of the major findings we've had in our cybersecurity outlook last year. It's that CISOs and security experts generally, they are on the whole extremely open to talking outside of their organization, to looking for routes to collaborate, whether that's via an ISAC, via technical collaboration, via simply a WhatsApp group, whatever it is. They're looking to find out what's there out in the wider landscape, what people are doing, and how they can support it. CEOs, and I would imagine this applies equally to senior members of the public sector and government, until something goes wrong, they want to focus on what they can control within their own organization. And luckily, that means that you'll see a lot of money going towards things like cybersecurity awareness programs. But frankly, and this is me giving a personal view, this isn't something you'll see in data. My personal view is that executives say cybersecurity is quite scary. It's a difficult topic for me to sometimes get my hands around. So I'm going to do something that I can control. I can see how many of my staff have been trained in X, Y, and Z. I don't understand what happens when my CISO goes to this collaboration group, whatever it might be, or this ISAC, and I can't translate it into dollars. And that's something that we need to start changing. We need to help these CEOs understand that this is about creating kind of an ecosystem that is more secure. That if we're going to compete on something like cybersecurity, we're competing against the criminals. We're not competing against the rest of our sector. And we've seen that in certain sectors like financial services, they get it. They places to go, but they get it. Groups like electricity and aviation, they're a bit less mature, but they get it as well. And they're good at getting there. And we need to really spread that as far as we can across all sectors and countries.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, Sean. It certainly is a key theme that we observe as well, like the high collaboration, the industry partnerships, private public partnerships. There is like a myriad of information sharing as it relates to the cybersecurity domain. It seems like it would be a big paradigm shift, though, for the executive level or even board of directors to move away from quantifying it into business value, so to speak, which is very much what they're used to. That's the language they speak, and move it into something that is, we actually need to build a collective cyber defense here. And that looks very different to the previous operating models that we're so well entrenched in. So would you have any observations or any thoughts as to how we get there or how we start to creep further into the lines of being in that information sharing domain as it relates to um, the rest of the ecosystem around the C-suite and how to simplify cybersecurity?
So I'll step back a bit into the wider kind of global perspective before we go into, let's say, metrics. One of the opportunities that the current geopolitical instability has created is that actually this is an easier entry point for many executives into discussions of cybersecurity than, let's say, technical issues or metrics or whatever else. So what we found, we asked a question last year, which was, how do you think geopolitical stability will impact cybersecurity risk across your ecosystem? We asked a very rough question, which was, how likely do you think it is to lead to a catastrophic cyber event in the next 2 years, the instability we're going through? And we expected that people would say things like catastrophic is a very strong word. Come on, I'm going to put a no to that one. We wanted to elicit a response to that one, but we found over 90% of our cyber executives and just less than 90% of the business executives said, yeah, we think it's actually quite likely. And we pushed that a bit forward, saying, all right, so that's a big statement. Where are we actually seeing some impact in that? When we went a bit more further down into our data, we could see that business executives were beginning to ask questions about cybersecurity when they invested in other countries. So for foreign direct investment, we said just less than 50% were saying that cyber risk was now a consideration. Now, that might be, what risk is there to our existing organization if we move into country X? Or it might be, if we invest in this piece of whatever it is, how secure is the wider ecosystem? Will the electricity go down from an attack? That kind of consideration is beginning to come in. And the geopolitical element allows that conversation to happen more easily, because executives are already used to thinking about, okay, so geopolitics affects trade, geopolitics affects regulation, it affects how bits and pieces and components move around. And now we have this additional thing called cyber risk, which is also, the volatility in it is potentially affected by geopolitics. So this is now a good time. It's a kind of sometimes people tell me it's a high risk topic. I think because people are used to reading about geopolitics in The Economist or whatever it is, it's an accessible topic. It's a good way of saying, here's here's what's happening. Here's how it affects the fact that there's possibly more cybercrime going on, whether that's connected to states or completely disconnected to states. And then going from there down to how it affects our business. So stepping in a bit more depth, you're asking about, how do we bring this into a business model as such? So I think you can't actually change the language in which executives talk. That is trying to make it think about how cybersecurity impacts their business. And there's a bit of work to be done on both sides here. And there's some environmental support, I call it, coming from regulators at the moment, which I'll go into in a sec. But basically, we find that the security teams really simply need to think a little bit better and clearer about how they speak about security. That very often we're talking about comfort zones with the executives. The comfort zone for many security executives is numbers. It's talking about indicators, the compromise, or whatever it might be. It's going to have to You're going to have to throw aside that comfort level and think, well, what message can I provide that actually means something to these people? How can I connect it to business operations? And even if you can't put a dollar amount on it, you can connect it to, here's potential downtime of our business, and you can all figure out what that means in dollars later on. So there are ways of bringing that there. On the other hand, board executives need to do a bit more to educate themselves. And that is very often helped along by regulators. So we've got the SEC saying to boards that you need to have somebody responsible for cyber risk. You've got Singapore suggesting that they might actually arrest people if they if executives consistently ignore good advice coming from the cybersecurity agency there. And you've got everything in between Europe and the Emirates and wherever else. So all in all, the regulators are putting more pressure on board members to get their act together on this. But also, I believe that there is more chance of an enabling environment. So we see statements being made by Jen Easterly and CISO in the US saying that we want to focus on outcomes. So it's going to become, at least at board level, a little less about pure tick box compliance and more saying, can you show us you have the governance? Can you show us that you have someone who has a clue on the board? Can you show us, and here's where I do make a recommendation, that actually cyber risk is integrated into how your business makes decisions? Because when we did our one-to-one interviews, the businesses that seem more comfortable about how they manage cyber risk and how they came back from a major attack were the ones that had said, yes, we have a cyber risk conversation when we launch a new product. We have it when we launch a new part of the organization, never mind a product. And it's there as part of the agenda on a consistent basis. So to summarize that, geopolitics, it's a bit scary, but use it. If you're from a cyber expertise background, it's the gateway into many of your executives' understanding. You do have to do a bit of work on figuring out, how does your business operate and what does this mean in kind of practical terms? If there's an attack, if something goes wrong, what does that mean? And I think support your board members as they try to get their heads around the new and sometimes scary obligations being put on them by their various regulators.
And I guess, Sean, I'd like to jump on what you mentioned about the geopolitical risk that is a conversation starter. I find that also supply chain risk is right on the same point as you made. When organizations want to look at expanding or want to look at their whole value chain, they often have this. Okay, what are the risks? And cyber risk is one of the major ones. We see that this is a topic that is more and more top of mind for all the CISOs, but also then the boards. It's one that's fairly easy to explain compared to, as we were saying, the more detailed technical cyber risks.
Joanna, from the CISO community perspective, is that still a frustration more generally in terms of understanding the business language, or is that finally becoming a known quantity and people are moving into understanding that language, being able to deliver the correct reports to their C-suite? I feel like it's still a frustration.
It is still a frustration. It is still a very much a top of mind issue. And we can see that there's still discussions about how to crack it, what's really gonna make it make the cut for cyber leaders to be understood. There is that increased awareness from board and exec about the risks brought by cyber and technology, but it's not always very clear for the board and execs how they should act on the information that is provided to them. So even though they ask for this information or receive this information, it's not necessarily always clear what they need to do. And I think that's also what's probably a little bit confusing still. And the CISOs are really looking for a global framework on that, what should be done across. And I think this conversation also links to the role of the CISO, how it's evolving. And I guess technology is evolving so fast that the role of the CISO is also evolving fast. And there's kind of like that catch up that needs to be made between the two levels.
And Joanna, just building on that, so the CISO can't be responsible for everything. There's an extent to which, okay, you have your technical teams, and that is your clear responsibility. But where the companies that are really ahead are the ones where the CISO's office has a consultancy role. So it's back to, is cyber risk something that's integrated and into your decision-making process, and for which responsibility is not just there for the IT and CISO and InfoSec team. And the CISO team can come in and consult and say, all right, what's going on? What does this mean? If you take this decision, what might happen? And help them work through it. But the responsibility stays with the other parts of the organization. So that's one way of getting over that hump of security experts will be security experts. That's what they're there for. They're not the business experts necessarily. And frankly, very often the businesses will put them into a silo, which makes it very difficult for them to become the experts. So one way of getting around that is that integration of cyber risk across how your business makes decisions. Regulation is going to make that easier to do over the next few years. But there's no harm for security executives using the regulations, waving them about, taking reports from places such as the World Economic Forum, waving them about in their boardroom and saying, actually, we need to go do this a bit more speedily.
Actually, in fact, we do have live footage of Ben running up and down the corridors with the World Economic Forum's Global Cybersecurity Outlook for 2023. So we'll have to get that over to you, Sean and Joanna.
It's slow-mo too, so it's fantastic. Just quickly on that, I just wanted to dial in on that quick point you just made there, Joanna, about the role of CISO changing. Talking with a few industry veterans and have been in the CISO role for some time, I'm interested in your thoughts on a comment that was made in a conversation I had that as a CISO in 2023, success is albeit unattainable unless you're protecting the environments from a cyber attack. So because the goalposts keep shifting, the role is changing so quickly, they're finding that success is albeit unattainable. Is that a common thread within the CISO community? Is that something that is concerning?
Well, I guess that's a broad one. It's dealing with risks, so obviously there's no such thing as success. Zero risk doesn't exist. So I'd say very much so. Then whether it's held against them is another question. And that's where I'd like to come back to who owns the risk. Cybersecurity is a business risk, so it should be owned by the business. And it's a conversation we've been having for years, right? So already when I was in my previous roles, that was a big issue with paying for cybersecurity, but also with to blame later when something goes wrong. And with the CISOs taking broader rules, or broader resilience rules, broader, it even goes to legal privacy sometimes. That mandates a shared responsibility. It really mandates a consolidated approach throughout the organization. And I'm even going to make a bridge to the cybersecurity culture. It's not only to do with the cyber teams. As we've seen in some type of organizations that are really focused on safety, thinking about oil and gas, but many others, they have over the years really embedded that safety culture, which means that even in the headquarters in big capital cities, you have safety, safety regulations, or when you walk in the building, you're not allowed to run or to go down the stairs without taking the handrail and things like that. And that's been pervasive throughout the whole organization. I think there's really that need to get a cybersecurity cultures embedded all across. And that's not an easy thing to do. That's also another things that companies are often struggling with. But it's essential if we want that more cohesive approach to cybersecurity overall.
It's a tough one, Ben. They just came out thick and fast with that, because I can totally empathize with the position around how do you define success? How do you achieve it? Rapidly changing environment, technological, regulatory. Yeah, totally
I think
understand.
Joanna made a great point there, is to mandate that shared responsibility. I completely agree that risk is a business collective problem. Cyber risk is a subset of risk, and therefore it's a shared collective responsibility. So I think that's something critical to maintain.
Just on the CISO role as well, because it brings it up, the level of dynamism in that role is really quite impressive, because, okay, it's because the way organizations are changing and technology is changing, etc. But what I'm seeing is that a lot of CISOs are saying, "Okay, I've had enough. Either I've burnt out and I want to leave the industry," which is really the worst case scenario. But very often actually it's saying, "I'm going to do something slightly different but connected." And you'll see CISOs becoming chief innovation officer or chief information officer, both of those. And what I found really interesting is the number. I only have anecdotal numbers, but moving into that chief innovation officer role. And what that says to me is that increasingly, um, they're not the CTO, but they're the core kind of, they're the ones who have to think most about the technology through the organization, thinking about how the stuff really moves through the veins of the organization. And that, when it comes to measuring success, I'm hoping over the longer term, it'll lead to a greater level of understanding of just how difficult it is to measure success in security and change the culture of how boards operate. But in the short term, it's like those horrible things when you say to your kid, you have to stay out in that football pitch, even though it's wet and cold, because it builds character. Really, it's probably just causing them pain. But same for the CISOs, that they're needed, they're necessary. We need to ensure that what they're doing is better understood. It's where organizations like the World Economic Forum and and you two running this podcast, getting the message out, are very important. So that the CISOs in particular aren't sitting in their own personal professional pain and just having to push through it. But success is something that I don't, until we change the understanding at board level of actually how security can be managed, who's responsible for it, and what success looks like, I don't think CISOs are going to be getting pats on the back.
And also I'd like to add to that if cybersecurity and the CISO's team is not called from the technology teams when they're doing their transformations, then it cannot fall back on the CISOs to be the ones responsible, because they weren't requested to provide their expertise in the first place and put the controls in place. So very often we see that willingness from the CISO team to be there and to do what's right, but also, which means that there is some kind of I would say resistance from the technology teams to open the door too much, because cyber is not yet seen as an enabler. And still, we're still back on the old, the old point that cybersecurity sometimes gets in the way of business and transformation, especially with the new technologies that we see emerging. So,
Yeah, until we see the collaboration and that action and the behavior cross-functionally in the organization, that'll be a really good indicator for sure. I want to dive into 3 really key areas of interest that I have personally to get your viewpoint, Sean and Joanna. The first one being, of course, the global cybersecurity outlook for 2023. Second one being the World Economic Forum's Cybercrime Atlas that was spoken about fairly recently as well in some of my daily circles. And then the third one being the Global Future Council on Cybersecurity, all part of the World Economic Forum. So perhaps I'll throw over to you, Sean, having quite an active role in the creation as the lead author for the Global Cybersecurity Outlook for 2023. And then we can go into the other two. But could you just give us the high level around some of the key trends, what you found interesting, bringing all of that to life?
Yeah, certainly. So in our Outlook report, I think it's worth talking about the aims of the report. So we're taking trends which are publicly available, comparing them against the actual lived experience of our cybersecurity experts at CISOs, CIOs, etc. And then the aim is not just to have something that a CISO can read and say, "Oh yes, I also have that experience," and it's not very pleasant. It's to give security experts something that they can bring to executives and help the executives understand the trends that are kind of swirling around them in cybersecurity, and give them some recommendations for navigating these security challenges. So I've already spoken a bit about geopolitics as the gateway drug for cybersecurity, getting the executives really interested in helping them understand. Um, but let's say thinking about a recommendation, actually the recommendations are often much more fundamental. So we've got this huge, very unstable threat landscape around. What does an executive need to do? Very often we're telling them you need to invest in more staff, is the first thing, So take something that we're all well aware of, cybersecurity skills gap globally is something like 3.5 million and growing. If you dig down into that, when we started asking companies, well, okay, well, really, where are you having the most problems? Well, we found that the sectors that were really stuck were energy and utilities, the public sector, so things like hospitals, schools, and then banking and capital markets. So despite being financial services really being most mature, while still having very heavy problems. What that means basically is that from a social point of view, cyber is the area that's going to keep the lights on, it's going to keep our salaries paid, and it's going to keep hospitals and schools open. So ensuring that people understand that this is that fundamental to how society operates and keeping everything just on an even keel, never mind allowing it to grow and flourish, which is also a requirement, it has been quite important. And as I said, when it comes down to the trends, more volatility, but what does that mean and where do you invest? Starting point is going to be in people. The next thing we noticed was one which I liked. The year before in 2022, we asked, what do you think of regulation, ladies and gentlemen? Do you like being regulated? Do you find it effective and useful? To which we had a low majority, but still a majority say, this is not helpful for my organization. The compliance requirements are taking up far more time than needed. It's duplicative, and we're putting resources into tick box that we could be putting into security. I think that will resonate with the experience of many. So this year, we changed the question slightly and said, all right, but what if we had better enforcement of regulations across your sector? And that's the point at which we had a good, strong majority, I think somewhere between 70 and 75% said, yes, actually, we do want better enforcement. We believe that regulation as a whole, if done properly, will make our sector across the board more secure. And what this is going in a slightly different direction. It's telling, first of all, executives within the private sector saying, this is going to keep happening because it's needed. So we need to put resources into thinking about how we apply regulation. But for governments across the board, it's saying, you can make laws, you can make policies. You actually need to be able to resource agencies that can properly review and supervise and enforce. And that doesn't mean going around and slapping people with fines for everything. It's really about saying, how do we ensure that organizations are able to do this? That again, to the extent possible, we're not putting just paperwork burden on organizations. And I believe that we're beginning to go in the right direction there. So you see, let's say with financial services again, which I know best, you've got industry, particularly in the US, has gotten quite good at working together on the basic compliance elements. You've got groups like the Cyber Risk Institute, which have mapped out all of these various rules across the states and other countries and said, well, how do we, these are all asking us to do versions of the same thing. How do we create an evidence base that allows us to do all of this once? And then across the board with the kind of main regulators we see in the US, UK, EU, Emirates, Singapore, Australia, to a less public extent, we're seeing statements saying we will focus on outcomes. So compliance is, of course, important, but what we really want to do is make everything a bit more secure. So I'd say from that point, that's where the trends are going, that everything's getting a little bit more volatile. And thankfully, that is not causing people to run around like headless chickens at the moment. They're thinking a little bit more clearly about the fundamentals, those fundamental changes we need to make. But let's say at a ecosystem level, as we like to say, with regulation, but also then fundamentally, what can I do in my organization? Now, you're asking about the cybercrime collaborations, and that's where I said earlier we have this gap that executives are much more likely to say, what can I do just within my organization? And cybersecurity experts are more likely to say, we can't do this alone. We need to start collaborating. The competition isn't that other company over there or that other agency across the river. It's the criminals. And there are an awful lot of really quite good attempts at collaboration. So everything from the Cyber Threat Alliance, the various ISACs, which thankfully keep expanding beyond sectors to things like OT. Um, And what the forum has been working on for several years now in cybercrime partnerships is saying, if everybody's trying to achieve the same thing and stop these criminals, why is it not working? And rather than pointing to a particular law or a particular data protection regulation or whatever else, let's push away the excuses and just look at what we can do to do this better. So the forum has had a group called the Partnership Against Cybercrime since at least 2019. That's brought together law enforcement from several countries in different regions, including representatives of Interpol and Europol, IT infrastructure providers, the likes of Microsoft and others, cybercrime, cyber threat companies and security companies, and everything in between. And it's been really just looking in detail, saying, at what point do our interests start to diverge? So, for example, if you have IT infrastructure, you want that group off it quickly to protect your clients. If you're law enforcement, while they mightn't put it in these same words, you might actually want them there a little bit longer so you can see what they're doing, identify who the individuals are, and eventually get towards arrests, because it's important, as well as disrupting them online, to try and show that there's a sense of justice, that you cannot operate as a cyber criminal with impunity. And out of the recommendations from that, we have over the last 18 months had groups of cybercrime investigators, threat analysts working together to try and map out the operations of a small number of cybercriminal groups, saying, all right, what do they do? How do they do it? Who are they? How do they interlink? And what I think is most interesting as this builds out, we're calling it a cybercrime atlas, so you're building out these maps. As it builds out, the hope is that we'll be able to see where they have shared infrastructure. Now, whether that's technical infrastructure, corporate infrastructure, they might be using the same money laundering services, who knows? And that helps all of those groups who are involved say, actually, this is where we have a pinch point. This is where we might be able to undertake some form of very useful disruption that has a much more magnified impact than elsewhere. Now, this is still at reasonably early stages. The work will be hosted in the forum for a few years to see what it needs in order to succeed. And I'm personally very much looking forward to see what this can do.
Frantically taking notes there, Ben, I see.
Yeah. I've run out of ink on my pen. I've gone to my black pen.
Yeah.
This is great.
No, I love it. Joanna, could you take us down what the Global Future Council on Cybersecurity is? Is that related to Cybercrime Atlas, some of the key trends taken out of the Outlook report? How does that come to life?
On this one, I think Sean has been running it for a few years, and I'll defer back to him. Just one point, if I may, on the previous one, just before the point of Sean. on regulations and enforcement. It also, and coming back to the topic of supply chain, and that's what I'd like to link here. Regulations, better enforcement of regulations also gives a bit of peace of mind to organizations that their supply chains are also going to be a bit more secure. I think that's why this year we'll see also this evolution, because this is difficult. This is something that seems very out of control for organizations, and anything that can help reduce or feel like they're more in control of their supply chain risks, especially that they are SMEs, they are bigger organizations, and usually organizations have so many vendors and software providers. There is a multiplication nowadays of software providers for even any type of cybersecurity tool. So that actually multiplies the type of vulnerabilities and the entry points that could be used for attacks. So yeah, just wanted to make that point, but back to you, Sean, for the GFC.
Just quickly, I just wanted to jump in there. I find that really fascinating, and it was a piece that that for me was very prominent in the World Economic Forum global report. One of the questions in here was, compared to my own organization's cyber resilience, I perceive our third-party organizations who have direct connections, processes, or data to be, and the answers were very broad. And it was quite shocking to me that a lot of the organizations sat within the equally as resilient, slightly more resilient, rather than far less resilient or far more resilient. So it's slightly concerning that business leaders and the cybersecurity leaders that were the respondents to this global report had such a broad understanding of their third-party supply risk.
And Joanna, I'll pass over to you in a second. But my view on that, we felt the same when we saw the stats. Is actually people were being fairly honest, and that it's a case that it's difficult for people to really understand what that risk is, and depending on what they can see and their gut feeling and experience, they'll take a view on it. But I think there is an element of gut feeling, regardless of the efforts that are put on to understand it. I'd make an argument with executives that it's outside of security. It's a bit easier for them to feel it's not our fault, it's someone else's. So there's a slightly higher level of people saying in business end saying we're much better off than our third parties, and that might be wishful thinking. Whereas the security experts, it really was quite broad, and I think that's just about the difficulty, not just overall of seeing your supply chain, but depending on what organization you're in, your capabilities and ability to see where you sit around everyone else is very different. And we went to quite a diverse group, so that's why the answer is spread out.
Yeah, it makes complete sense. We will share this in the show notes, and for all that are interested, this is figure 14 if you're looking for this graph that we're referring to now. From my perspective, I agree, Sean. I think it's probably the most difficult thing to quantify, and then how to remediate that risk is such a significant event in itself, let alone the transformation that has to happen internally with business to secure that third-party supply risk. I can only imagine, Joanna, this is something that gets brought up in the CISO community quite regularly.
For sure, and that what we've been discussing is also the importance of building trust with your third parties. Yes, it's a lot of third parties, so I guess it comes with starting to prioritize them based on their criticality to your business processes and therefore to your organization as a whole. And that trust is essential. And it comes back to the point Gabby was making about information sharing. When you establish trust, and back to Sean's point, actually, that CEOs are more likely to call other CEOs as well, which is the case for CISOs as well. They won't necessarily call a generic number, but they know their friends and their peers that are there to support them, going back to trust. And obviously, there are more technical controls to put into place, like a third-party risk management program and things like that. But I think that's the next step.
Sean, something that we oftentimes rabbit hole on the Dark Mode podcast is absolutely where the future of humanity is going as it relates to technological advancement. Now, there is so much literature and information on the World Economic Forum as it relates to emerging technologies. I even note reports on quantum encryption, quantum security, and the like. In fact, fairly recently we did host an episode on Dark Mode around quantum computing. So that just takes us into a whole sort of mind-bending domain of thought. Maybe we'll come back into just the emerging technologies landscape, but have you got thoughts on, and this might even be related to the work that you're leading with the Global Future Council on cyber, but certainly, big megatrends related to tech, AI, and the like is really transforming the landscape. What are you seeing personally in some of your conversations day to day?
Yeah, so I'll relate back to the work of this Global Future Council. So what is it? It's a council of experts that we draw globally, and they think about the near future in their particular sphere. So in cybersecurity, what we try to do is link them into the forum's wider network. So it's an idea that we can bring people who have very high levels of expertise and at least some decision-making power within cybersecurity, people who have an ability to shape the environment of it. And apart from giving them a space where they can talk very openly with each other and just test out ideas, we can link those ideas into other groups. So, for example, last year, our cybersecurity experts said, actually, we're a little bit worried about the way satellites are developing. We don't feel that the risk is fully understood or necessarily that we fully understand the risk. And we can put them straight in with our satellites community and have them work together and get going on something. In relation to what's happening this year with the big mega trends, on AI in particular, and I think regardless of who I'm speaking to, be they academic, government, be they like someone who's very deep into the AI or thinking on a more high level, it's really about how do we ensure that we do think about this longer term extinction event type conversation, but not forgetting about the immediate risks. That the immediate risks not just to our security, but to the equity within our decision making, fairness in how we go about doing things, and then ensuring that once we started really using things like Gen AI or whatever version of AI is du jour at the moment or next week, that people feel it's sufficiently secure and resilient that they're not afraid of it, so that the benefit of the tools are available, but that we're also doing sufficiently to protect people. That's not just about the security element. Security is core, but it's really about trust in these new digital tools. So, how to put it? Regardless, I think that is repeated regardless of the technology type. It's how do we prepare over the longer term for the terrifying bit, which is usually in the longer term, without forgetting the things that will actually make our lives better or worse right now. And I think Gen AI is a very good example. Yes, it's going to have an immediate impact on phishing attacks, on the quality of, you're not going to get quite the same level of random Russian isms within your English language phishing emails as they come in. But at the same time, we already have partnerships we can see in the US working on exactly how to counter that. So, it's a tool. It'll help us. It'll create its own difficulties. And what we're hearing is whatever that tool is, whatever that technology is, how do we focus on what's the problem now without forgetting about what the bigger problem could be in a few years?
Yeah, so taking a more pragmatic approach to the immediate near-term future, whilst also oscillating around the longer-term horizons and what those implications are and how to build that preparedness and the resilience around it.
Yeah, and quantum is one of those areas. People have very different opinions on whether we're 2 years, 3 years, or 20 years away from this being a real and serious problem or a real and serious utility. And we won't take a view on that. We're not the experts, but we will remind everybody that whether you think it's happening tomorrow or very far from now, something needs to be done. And was the last point, I think something that's forgotten very often because it's not as exciting. Whatever that technology is getting layered on top of the legacy tech. And the legacy tech was layered upon other tech, and that's messy. So what that creates is this quite high level of unpredictability. So there's no point, and this is back to CISOs and success, is that it's very difficult to put success criteria on something that's that unpredictable. So it's really about ensuring that we have organized ourselves as well as thought about the technical solutions, but organized ourselves and how we operate in a way that we're ready to bounce back from whatever hits us.
And I guess that discussion on new technology is essential, but sometimes it derails us from going back to basics. As Sean says, there are those legacy systems. So basic cyber hygiene is still key for organizations to be protected. You can protect well, obviously it's key also to implement security by design, resilience by design when you implement new technology, because now we're in 2023. So hoping that's being taken into account. But at the same time, there are also all those vulnerabilities that exist behind it, and that needs to be back into it. And the culture we spoke about before about cybersecurity throughout the organization is, whether we're talking about legacy IT systems or new technology, is going to be the same. So yeah, just going back to sometimes it gets CISOs or organizations derailed from what is really essential.
Yeah. I can put in a bit of optimism as well. So back to this Global Future Council group, which includes a lot of expertise from Australasia and ASEAN, actually. So we're lucky to have the Australian Chief Scientist, Dr. Kathy Foley, on there. We have Gaurav Kirti, who's Deputy Chief Executive at the Singapore Cybersecurity Agency. And also from Australia, and talking about quantum, we have Vikram Sharma, who's founder of Quintessence Labs. That we have these very varied groups from every region on the earth. And they are thinking about this, and they are trying to work their way through these problems, which are not problems that have clear solutions for anybody. And we can see that at this very top level, and we can see that as we go down through our CISO communities and through their staff, that everyone is trying. So I suspect that we'll get through, whether the AI risk, we'll get through it, whatever the quantum risk, we'll get through it, whatever it might be, because it's not that people are saying, there aren't really climate deniers when it comes to cybersecurity, is what the way I'd put it. Thank God. So I'd be much more optimistic that whatever the problem is, while it'll cause shocks here and there, we're working towards doing something about it. And while I wouldn't say any CISO is going to sleep very well at the moment, at the same time, I think we're making progress.
The Futures Council I find fascinating, and for the community of dark mode, it is around 600 of the most relevant, knowledgeable thought leaders grouped into, for what is 2023 to 2024, 29 expertise-based thematic councils. Some of the titles of these, Gabe, I feel like you would just froth being a fly on the wall in some of these conversations. There is from future of care economy to future of clean air. There is future of good governance, good being the key term in that one, future of quantum economies, synthetic biology, all the way down to future of trade and investment. I just think it is an absolute fascinating group of people that would be amazing just to be a fly on the wall with some of those conversations.
And they do publish their work. So their work will be published. I recommend anyone who's interested, if you type in World Economic Forum and Global Future Council, you'll get to that long list. And it is genuinely a joy to be, I am the fly on that particular wall, and it's a genuine joy. As I said, it gives me quite a bit of optimism as to the direction we're going.
Nice. Very cool. Sign me up. Hey, Sean, Joanna, I was really interested in some of the work published just around the region here, down under, Australia, New Zealand, Oceania, in the Asia Pacific region. Could you give us a bit of a flavor around sort of the status of cybersecurity, status of cybercrime as it relates to this region in particular, and how it stacks up to the global economy, so to speak?
John, if you're happy, I'll start, and you can make whatever I say more useful. But what I find is, look, the good thing again is that there's a huge level of pragmatism. What I found, so the region is enormous and it's extremely varied. It's not like Europe. It's not like even the Americas. Never mind North America and South America. The degree of variation is very, very high. But whether we're talking to agencies or companies based around Vietnam, Thailand, Cambodia, that area, or Singapore, Indonesia, or Australia, there really is I would believe, a higher level of pragmatism. Everybody just saying, what is the problem? What do we need to prioritize? And how do we go about dealing with it? Now, the answer isn't always the right one, but the fact of the matter is it's a very pragmatic approach across. And also that I think when it comes to building the capacity within, you've got this very wide range of development within the region across countries. But there's again a pragmatic approach to understanding where there are capacity gaps, how that can be built in the private sector, how it can be built in the public sector. I think it's too short a podcast to go into the details of exactly what those developments are. It could be for another one. But for cybercrime, again, you've great variation. So that's where I have difficulty making recommendations, because you've everything from the type of phishing and business email compromise and whatever that's experienced across the world, to the slightly, for us, exotic and frightening sitting in Europe idea of triad gangs kidnapping people in one country, bringing them to another to work as fraud slaves, undertaking cyber attacks. And these problems are all going to have to be dealt with in very different ways. Where you have, I think, a disadvantage is the region isn't as integrated as some other ones. So in Europe, which is very highly integrated, collaboration is not easy, but it's a far sight easier than in most other parts of the world. So I can only imagine how difficult it is, given the diversity of countries, the diversity of different legal systems, the pure spread of languages. That it's all just there's a little bit more friction when it comes to tackling cybercrime. And notwithstanding all that, the approaches are quite pragmatic and show some success.
Did you have anything further there, Joanna, to add? Super interesting, by the way, Sean.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I would agree with Sean's point and collaboration that is made harder, probably. Now for international organizations that operate across countries, I guess there's this awareness and this knowledge about other regulations, other ways of doing cybersecurity, and what are the challenges. And that, I guess, for multinational organization, that helps with collaboration, because as international organizations, they need to comply with other other standards. So there's that awareness and that those links that already exist.
Yeah, I mean, another advantage you have, I think, is focusing in Australia. So first of all, you've got very highly developed community within the defense sector, within the academic sector, within business when it comes to tech. You also have quite good international agreements between, I can't remember, what was it, the Quad called over your way?
Well, yep.
The Quad. So just the idea of looking at how expertise is shared, that creates things. And you can't predict what it's going to create. But I liked the idea of the Quad because, okay, it's formed a little bit, looking like a bit of a security partnership. From what I could see with the collaborations it can create via universities, it's going to create a lot of very useful stuff that we can't predict. Also within the region, you have Interpol's primary cybercrime group is based out of Singapore. And that just means that it's that bit easier to provide support to law enforcement across all the countries in the wider region. So there are some advantages. Countries like Singapore, countries like Australia, Indonesia, Philippines, Malaysia, also very, at various levels of maturity, but essentially quite good at this. And then you have that from a law enforcement perspective, Interpol right there in the geographic middle and in the hub of Singapore, and very able to help law enforcement across many countries.
Yeah, it's very, very interesting in terms of how we stack up and just the diversity and the spread across the region as well.
What's your own experience? Because I work with organizations based in your region, but I don't live or work there. So what's your own experience?
Yeah, for me, I see a lot of collaboration, like very open-mindedness, want to be on the sort of leading edge as it relates to cybersecurity in particular, even general tech advancements. And then I would say as well, there's always the classic notion, especially in Australia, of betting above the average. And so being willing to take on more than sort of how we stack up, whether by size or, economic value and that sort of thing. So that's really promising as it relates to cyber. And I think we do also have really bold ambitions as well. Like you would have seen very publicly in more recent times, our Minister for Cybersecurity in Australia came out and said we want to be the most secure nation in the world by 2030. So that's just really putting an entire stronghold on the entire economy and the entire society to say this. We are very serious about this, and it means a lot to us. And we have to recognize, again, back to the collaboration point, we can't do it alone. But here we're making a stance, and we're going to be very collaborative and consultative in our approach to achieving that, and bring together global and local best practice in terms of getting there.
And my experience at the World Economic Forum over the last 5 years is that ambition gets you places. So those statements made by your Minister for Cybersecurity, that does move things along. And It's
Absolutely.
the most secure
Yeah.
country in the world. You're going to have competition. There's others who want to be there
We
as well.
will. Yeah, I
But the
know.
fact, yeah, exactly.
Gotta go for it,
And
Sean. Yeah.
yeah, and I grew up watching the international rules matches between Australia and Ireland,
Yeah.
between Aussie rules and GAA, and we'd prepare for them, but you tended to beat the stuffing out of us physically, whatever the scoreboard was. So, I mean, one way or another, Australia found a way of winning. And I don't
We'll
doubt,
do it
I
in
don't
cyber
doubt you'll
too,
find
Sean.
it there. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like
What are
a
your
cross
thoughts?
between Gaelic football and AFL. I remember those matches and still thinking to this day, how is that possible? And what is this sport?
Yeah. Yeah.
I've
So,
got a different approach to that, Gabe, to your answer there is coming from the defense background. I was fortunate enough to work with and collaborate with a number of our APAC or Indo-Pacific partners and help train and knowledge share and develop capabilities to build out the region. And I think that's an advantage we have here is we understand that it's regional. It's more broader than just Australia and New Zealand. It includes the rest of the Asia Pacific region. Whereas I think, the North Americas is very structured around North America and the UK and Europe is very structured around the UK and Europe. We've got the ability to have a broader understanding. And I think the Quad is a great representation of that. For the audience listening, the Quad agreement is between India, Japan, Australia, and the United States. So a great example of some of the foreign policy that's being shared. But having been part of that in my defense days, I can attest to over the years in that 10-year period, seeing foreign military services take on the knowledge that we've shared and develop capabilities that sit alongside that to develop a stronger united front as a region.
and it's a cliche, but look, diversity of ideas matters, and you do that in your region. So if you think about capacity building in cybersecurity, Australia does quite a lot of work out in the Pacific Islands, quite impressive. It follows a model which is not dissimilar to what you see in Western Europe. And then you'll have the Japanese approach, which again does do some of the traditional capacity building, but you can see them taking an approach which is, it's been described by a group called the Cybercrime Institute. It's a plug for one of our members on our Global Future Council, Yuri Ito, but she's been thinking about it as a public health model. So thinking a bit like pandemic management. How do you gather the data on where the public health problem is likely to come up? We've seen that from the Japanese, and this diversity of ideas between groups like Australia in the south, Japan in the north, and everything in between does make it, frankly, a very interesting region to look at. I don't know what it feels like to live in, so again, grateful for your own thoughts, but it's very interesting. In some areas, the region is very much one that is leading and one that is looked to see what's happening.
Yeah, I think it's and from people that live in the area, it's nice and warm at the moment in the Gold Coast. I'm not sure what it's like in Sydney at the moment, Gabe, in winter, but my winter on the Gold Coast here is 24 degrees and sunny. So fortunate for that. Eyebrows raised then, Sean. You're like, that's not even my temperature in summer.
It's midsummer here, and we are at 25 degrees.
Fantastic, fantastic. Look, there's been so much information we've covered in this podcast. I think we're going to turn it into 2 episodes, perhaps. But I wanted to get your thoughts, Joanna. We opened the conversation with the private and public collaboration. To date, it's been somewhat siloed. I know that's changing. We opened up the conversation with how important public and private collaboration is. Would you mind taking us through, why that is, you believe it's siloed to date and how we can overcome that moving forward?
Yes, I guess it's a very broad question because it also depends where we apply public-private collaboration. That can be on many different things. It can be on cybercrime, as Sean said. It can be on supply chains. It can be on cyber skills, etc. So it's a very, very good question that I'm going to try to see how best to answer there. I think it's not always. So I think there are many facets to it. And Sean, at some point, please jump in and add your point as well. One of the points I would think is that it's not that public and private are not willing to collaborate with each other, but sometimes they don't really understand how to collaborate with each other. We've been discussing a lot, especially with the electricity industry and information sharing. There are so many different types of information to be shared, right? Depending on what you want to achieve. So very often we preach, let's have better information sharing across the industry between public and private sectors, even with academia, etc. But what for, right? Comes down to what are we trying to achieve? Because you can share, I don't know, threats, real-time threats. You can share vulnerabilities, but you can also share good practices, some lessons learned from whether it's been attacks or anything that's been happening. So it's just coming down to sometimes the problem maybe hasn't been framed the right way, and therefore the collaboration doesn't flow that easily. So I would say that's one thing. But there is this willingness from all parts to collaborate. So that's why I'm really hopeful. And if we continue discussing it and really making sure we'll drive action there, we'll finally get there. But it's getting slow.
Right. And the silos, look, there's a basic human element to this, and that's trust. And that goes across sectors. So some sectors, like financial services, they've been forced to work together on this for a much longer period than others. And that just simply makes it easier. And it makes it more difficult for them to say, we've got this great idea, let's pass it off to, God knows, retail, supermarkets, whatever it might be, because the other sectors don't have that habit of working together on these topics. It's much more competitive. So it's about developing that trust over time. Another element is frankly the ability to get non-cyber buy-in. And again, we've seen good practice from financial services when they were setting up. I can't even remember the number of acronyms from coming out of the US, but it just shows the amount of partnerships they have set up on this. And one approach they brought in, particularly with information sharing and showing its value, was to get your board briefed by someone who's external. And often CISOs in particular will have some sort of law enforcement relationship. We found that works well, that bringing in a senior member, seniors you can get of law enforcement to your board to say, here's how we use it. Here's how this protects you. Here's why we need to talk with each other. Here's why even if you never talk to us in law enforcement, you should be talking to your partners. And that sort of whatever you can do to create a sense among the individuals that make these decisions that this is something you should be involved in. This is something that has value, and this is something that is going to lower your risk rather than increase it. That helps. And with some sectors, we have to start from scratch. And with some sectors, they're already very well developed. And I think the electricity sector example that Joanna brought up is a very good one. The electricity sectors in most countries, particularly grids, have fantastic expertise in cybersecurity, have fantastic knowledge that they can share across all sectors. And the starting point for getting them to work on this was very much saying, let's talk with other grids and let's see how you interact, where the problems are shared. And over time, again, building that human element of trust, which then can be turned into institutional trust, which then can be turned into, you have a couple of gaps here, ladies and gentlemen. You can all see what's happening in electricity, but you also need to understand what these actors are doing elsewhere so you can see what's coming your way. And then you can start this multi-sector conversation. But to back it up then, silos, it's because of habits of collaboration, which are better in some sectors than others. And then you have to create the understanding of the need to collaborate, and then you have to build trust. Same as anything in any sort of intelligence work. You'll have a governance structure. You'll have this thing that says you're allowed to talk to X, Y, and Z. You're usually going to pick up the phone to the person you know first.
Fantastic points all around. There seems to be, in my experience, some old laggard mentality around the threat sharing between, or just sharing in general between public and private collaboration. I feel like the private sector sometimes look at the government in terms of that piece to this equation, the Wolf in the Little Red Riding Hood story, and then on the flip side, the government sees the public industry as the boy who cried wolf. They're conscious not to overshare, and therefore at the right time, their knowledge isn't embraced at the right time. I feel like embrace is the key word there. We just need to embrace that knowledge sharing and that public-private collaboration and remove some of those silos. As you mentioned, the electricity example is a fantastic example. I work with that daily, and I can see how collaborative that industry is. And it really is doing some great things. So if we can use that as a shining light or as a North Star towards where we should be, I think we'll all be in a better place. We have probably covered more information than my little notebook has. And I've probably got arthritis in my wrist from taking so many notes here. I've taken 3 pages today, so I appreciate both of you. I know that our dark mode community will have a fun time listening to this and taking in the information that we've shared throughout. So from myself and Gabe in the dark mode community to yourself, Sean, and to yourself, Joanna, I just want to say thank you for the work you do and thank you for spending the time with us on this episode.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ben and Gabby.
Thanks,
Sean.
team. Gabe,
Joanna.
anything you want to leave before we give this a solid wrap?
Oh, no, I think that was great. I mean, lots of interesting points for me. Personally, a big advocate for starting at the geopolitical level. I think the macro framing's really, really interesting and relevant. And then all sorts of things that I would love to recap, but in the interest of time, I think we do salad wrap it there, Ben. But I do just want to quote Sean as we end, which was there's not really any climate deniers in cyber. So thank you both for coming on today and sharing your expertise to the wider dark mode community. We really appreciate it.
Thank you for inviting us. That makes us want to speak more and more, I guess, with you and further keep in touch on that.
Please do.
Thanks so much.
Thank you both.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to our YouTube channel or leave us a rating on your favorite podcast platform. See you on the next episode of Dark Mode.